Hey, I'm Brooks from brooksbrowncoaching.com, and in this video, I'm going to be discussing insulin resistance. What is insulin? How does insulin resistance develop? What are some symptoms of it, and how you may be able to reverse it? So I want to start off by defining what insulin is so we kind of are all on the same page. Like I said, then we'll talk about some symptoms. And finally, I'm going to tell you how to maybe back this off. If it sounds like something you may be dealing with, there's some potential options for you. So insulin is a protein hormone that is created in your pancreas by beta cells. And now you might have heard of insulin referred to in terms of a medication for type 2 diabetics. It is that to help control blood sugar, but you're naturally producing this in your body for the same reason, as well as a bunch of other things. So insulin is being used by every cell in your body. That makes it kind of a unique hormone in that sense. Additionally, insulin is the most anabolic hormone in the body because it is responsible for storage. So I'm going to go through a list here of things that it does in the body, just hit some high points. But I want you to notice that a lot of the things I'm going to refer to, I'm going to tell you that one of the functions of insulin is growth. So when we think of growth in the body, it doesn't necessarily have to be getting bigger, but everything in the body is either growing or breaking down. Now that's very simplified. There's a lot of different processes going on, but if something's not growing, it's breaking down, because if it's growing and breaking down at the same time, that's where you get sort of a stasis where you have something staying the same size, but there has to be growth going on all the time or a total breakdown is happening. So keep that in mind when I mention growth. So I'm just going to go through the list here. In the brain, we have glucose used for energy. These are all things that insulin are doing. Glucose used for energy and neuron growth. In the ears, glucose used for energy and hearing. In the heart, energy use, heart size, and lowering of blood pressure. In the muscles, energy use, muscle protein production and size. In the fat, we have glucose conversion to fat, fat storage and growth. In the liver, glucose storage and fat production. In the testicles and ovaries, normal sex hormone production. And bone, energy use and growth. And in nerves, glucose for energy and growth. So clearly very important, like you hear me say, a lot of growth happening and a lot of utilization of glucose for energy. Now, all of the things I mentioned are happening as planned in a body that is appropriately insulin sensitive. Now, what do I mean by that? Insulin sensitivity means that when insulin acts on these cells, when these cells are in the presence of the circulating insulin, they perform the process they're supposed to under those circumstances. So for instance, if we are appropriately insulin sensitive, meaning not insulin resistance, and we have insulin circulating in the body, then the muscle cells will start to use glucose for energy. All right. So that's just one example. In the liver, is the insulin is in the right place and we have appropriate insulin sensitivity, those cells will start to store glucose, or they will start to produce fat. So that's what the things I'll list is what's supposed to happen if you're appropriately insulin sensitive. Now, a problem that is growing all over the world, really, particularly in Western countries, is people are becoming insulin resistant. Now, the way that happens, I want you to think of insulin resistance as a tolerance. Your cells are growing a tolerance to insulin. Now, first you need to understand that insulin is secreted by the pancreas when there is a presence of blood sugar or blood glucose. When your blood glucose levels rise, insulin levels rise as well to bring those blood glucose levels back down and to use that blood glucose, for all of those different processes that I mentioned, as well as many others that I didn't mention. So what increases your blood glucose? Well, eating food. All food increases blood glucose to a certain point. However, carbohydrates increase your blood glucose the most, and simple carbohydrates like sugar or wheat increase it the most out of the carbohydrates. So we'll talk a little bit more about different foods and carbohydrates at the end when I give you some ideas of what maybe you can do if you are facing some resistance. But I just want you to understand that eating particularly carbohydrates is going to raise those blood glucose levels, which is then going to raise those insulin levels. Now, we have an abundance of food now an abundance of processed food, which a lot of them have simple carbohydrates that are keeping our blood sugar really high all the time, which also means that our insulin levels are having to stay really high to try to control those blood sugar levels. If blood sugar levels go unaddressed in the blood, you can develop something that's called glucotoxicity in different cells, where that high blood sugar level will actually start to cause damage. And so that is why our body wants to produce that insulin to keep those levels in check. That's why a person with type 2 diabetes or even type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes, has to take insulin to be able to suppress those blood glucose levels where they don't get too high and start to cause that glucotoxicity, which will create a whole host of problems, some of which you're going to probably recognize here when I talk about some symptoms. So let's look at some pretty easily identifiable symptoms of people that are having this issue of insulin resistance. Again, that resistance coming from those insulin levels being really high because of the high blood glucose. The insulin levels stay high, which means all these cells are constantly being exposed to insulin, and now they're creating a tolerance. So that's why I said I wanted to think of that word tolerance. It's like if you are someone who drinks alcohol, you probably understand that over time you're able to drink more alcohol without feeling inebriated or drunk. It's because you're building a tolerance to that alcohol. In the same sense, your cells are building a tolerance to insulin if they are constantly in the presence of it because of high blood glucose, high insulin levels. Try to keep it checked. All right, so some symptoms of insulin resistance. One, this is almost going to be ubiquitous with any type of metabolic disorder or metabolic disease. You're going to see abdominal obesity. Now, I've talked about this in other videos. It is the fat around your stomach called visceral fat. It produces that big beer gut that's typically really hard. Even though like jiggly fat might be unsightly, believe it or not, that is typically a more healthy type of fat than that hard visceral fat. So big distended stomach, and over a 40-inch waist for men, over a 35-inch waist for women, there is a higher potential that that person has insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance. Same thing. Elevated blood sugar. Typically, if you test your blood glucose fasted, you want that number to be under 100 milligrams. So under that level, you're having a normal insulin response. Your insulin is able to bring blood sugar levels down. If those numbers are between 100 and 125, again, this is a fasted test. So this would be first thing in the morning. You test, you do a finger stick, test your blood glucose. Between 100 and 125 is considered pre-diabetic. If you were in that range, likely there's insulin resistance involved. That insulin is not working as effectively as it should. Over 126, that is type 2 diabetes. So at that point, something definitely has to be done, but that is the number where you actually would be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes if you measured those fasted glucose levels at over 126 2 times. That's the study. Okay, Acanthosis Nigricans. This is dark skin. Usually it's going to be around the creases where there's friction. So you'd see it around your neck, around like the fold in your elbow, armpits, inside of the thighs, back of the knee, anywhere where skin is folding. If you see a darkening of skin, that is because of insulin's impact on melanocytes. So melanocytes is what's making melanin, which is coloring your skin. If they're exposed to too much insulin, they will become overactive and they will start darkening skin, particularly in those areas where there's friction. Now, it doesn't have to just be in the neck or just in places where there's folds of skin. You might see patches, dark patches that are not just like a freckle, but they could be on your chest, typically around the trunk, but they could be anywhere. You know, they might be the size of a dime. They could be bigger, but discoloration, darkening of skin is often a sign of insulin resistance. Skin tags, often in the same areas. So if you're not familiar, skin tag is like a little bit of skin that seems to grow out rather than growing across. Most people are pretty much familiar with it. This is insulin acting on the keratin production areas in your skin. So they're creating this kind of abnormal growth. Many women will have experience with them during pregnancy because pregnancy is a naturally insulin resistant period of time. I'm not going to go into exactly why that is in this video, but just know that women usually experience insulin resistance of about 50% from pregnancy, and that is totally normal. That's a healthy pregnancy.
You could look more into that if you're interested, but that gives us kind of a good case study of what can happen with insulin resistance. Of course, we don't want to get out of check, which can happen, which can lead to things like gestational diabetes and preeclampsia, but it is naturally an insulin resistant time and comes with those skin tags. If you have them and you're not pregnant, you can see maybe that's a sign that you're dealing with some insulin resistance. Psoriasis. Psoriasis are it looks like a rash. Usually it can be big, but you might see small quarter size red areas. The margins of it, meaning the outside milk, might look kind of scaly. They might look kind of white or silver. It could be dry. But psoriasis can cover big patches, often seen around the joints, but it can be anywhere on the body. It might look like a rash or a dry spot you just can't seem to get rid of. Large pores and acne. So a lot of young people, it doesn't have to be young people, but obviously young people are experiencing more acne typically in adults. What's going on? The reason that insulin resistance can cause acne is because that insulin is acting on your skin to produce more skin cells, but it's also acting on these oil glands that are producing sebum, which is your skin oil. So if you get the combination where you're getting a lot of both of those, so that extra skin is clogging up pores, and behind those clogged pores, it's producing a lot more oil, which is going to lead to those blackheads and then pimples. Blackheads, if you didn't know, are actually just oxidized sebum. So that oil, that oxidizes and turns that color, and some mixed with dirt. And so the same thing goes for like what you're seeing in pimples, that's oxidized sebum. And so that's another sign of insulin resistance. Hearing loss, particularly hearing loss associated with low tone. So if you start not hearing low tones, that could be a potential side or a potential symptom of insulin resistance. As I mentioned at the top, insulin is being used for hearing in your ears. Tinnitus. Tinnitus is ringing in your ears. Now, if you've ever been, if you shoot guns or you've ever been around a real loud noise, something loud goes off near you, and then afterward you hear that kind of real high-pitched ring for a while. Now, I'm not saying that if you shoot a gun and you hear a ring that you have insulin resistance. I'm just giving that as an example. Now, tinnitus, people will experience that same kind of ringing in their ears even when they haven't experienced a loud noise. So they can have that kind of ring going on. That is a big sign of insulin resistance. About 92% of people dealing with tinnitus do have hyperinsulinemia, which is high levels of insulin. Slow wound healing. This is something that most diabetics that are managing their diabetes well, they're very acutely aware of the fact that if they are injured, they will not heal as well if they are not managing their blood glucose as well. So this is one of the reasons that if you go in for surgery, they're going to test your A1C, which is kind of a long-term test of your blood glucose, as well as your current blood glucose, to understand if you will be able to heal quickly enough to maybe not get infections or something like that after you do have a surgery. Okay, moving on. Osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis is the breaking down of the cartilage in your joints until the cartilage in your joints are the cushion surfaces that make your joints slip past each other well without pain. You don't have nerve endings in that cartilage, and so you can move relatively well without pain. When that cartilage wears away, you end up with bones rubbing on each other. There are nerve endings in those bones, and that can be very painful. The reason that can happen is these high insulin levels, once these cells get to a place where they're no longer responding to this insulin, they're not utilizing the glucose to really keep up this network in the joint and keep the cartilage healthy. That cartilage will start to break down. There's also something that can happen in the joints called glycation, which will make that cartilage a little more brittle and make it break down a little more readily. Insulin also creates these messed up levels, these resistant levels can affect the synovial fluid inside of your joint, which is like the lubricating fluid inside the joint. And if that is not working the way it should, then you can start to get some inflammation in the joint that will create pain as well. So we have synovial fluid around all of our joints. If that fluid gets inflamed and that joint gets inflamed, you're going to start experiencing joint pain. So osteoarthritis, any of that can be associated with, this hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, high blood sugar levels. So keep that in mind. Gout. Gout is a high deposition of uric acid in a joint. Typically, you find it in like a big toe or a thumb. Now, how is this related to insulin? Insulin resistance can cause the kidneys to accumulate uric acid rather than excreting uric acid. And then that uric acid can circulate through the body and then find a place to sit where it will produce a crystal that will cause inflammation in the joint. And that's how you end up with gout. So those insulin levels can really affect that. Muscle loss and performance loss. Like I said, insulin is the most anabolic hormone in the body, and it is responsible for our muscle growth by utilizing the blood glucose that's circulating when our insulin levels get high, and we've exercised the muscle, so it's stimulated, and it's telling the body, hey, we need to regrow the fibers we just broke down. Then that insulin will shuttle that glucose into those muscles, and with also in combination with amino acids, will start to repair that muscle. If those cells are not responsive to insulin, we're not going to have that process happen. So we'll start seeing negative protein turnover. Remember what I said before, if you're not growing, you're breaking down. It's got to be a balance to even stay in the same place, but there's always needs to be growth going on, even if there is tear down happening. So with protein turnover, what's happening in your muscles, you have that growth and breakdown at the same time. If there's more growth, less breakdown, you have actual hypertrophy, growth of the size of the muscle. If it's equal, you're in a maintenance position. If you have more breakdown than you have growth, the muscle's getting smaller. So those muscle cells not reacting to the insulin and storing that glucose the way they should will lead to more breakdown than growth. Joint pain. Like I mentioned before, that can come from that synovial. It can come from a number of things related to insulin resistance, whether it's gout, that uric acid circulating, the inflammation in the joints. There is some evidence that insulin resistance might be really related to fibromyalgia, which is sort of a generalized pain. There needs to be more study done on that, but it does seem to appear that a lot of people that complain of fibromyalgia are insulin resistant. Dyslipidemia. This is essentially messed up cholesterol levels. Really low HDL levels, which is considered good cholesterol, really high LDL levels, which is considered bad cholesterol. I do quotes because it's really not that simple. There are different sizes of low density lipoproteins, that's LDL cholesterol, that we have to be worried about. We're more concerned about the small ones than we are the big ones, pattern A and pattern B. There's all this. That can get really complicated. However, I'll probably do a whole video on cholesterol at some point. But just know that insulin resistance, because of the way, particularly that it affects your liver, which is really where all that stuff is being produced and where you're kind of deciding if you're going to have HDL or LDL. That's why it can cause dyslipidemia. It can mess up that process. Additionally, your triglycerides, which is sort of all the free-floating fatty acid in your body, usually will get really high because we're having a disruption in the storage process. Okay, so if those weren't bad enough, we can get into some more kind of disturbing potential symptoms here. Hypertension. Now, hypertension caused by insulin resistance is coming from a few different things. One, insulin, we'll go first with what's actually happening in the blood vessels. So insulin acts on endothelial cells, which are the cells inside of your blood vessels that line your blood vessels. When it acts on those blood vessels, it makes them grow. Remember, growth is fine normally. All of these cells need insulin, just in the right amounts. If we're getting them too much, then what happens with those endothelial cells is they'll continue to grow. And so if you think of something like a hose, that being your blood vessel, if the inside wall of that hose keeps growing, what's going to happen? It's not going to get any longer. It's going to get narrower. So now we're restricting blood flow because that endothelial cell just keeps on growing. So we have a narrower space to pump blood through, which obviously is going to increase blood pressure. You know, the same amount of fluid through a smaller container is going to be higher pressure. Additionally, in the presence of insulin, you have secretion of nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, meaning that's a compound that makes your blood vessels expand. Now, if those cells become insulin resistant as they're exposed to insulin over and over and over, they don't have the correct response. They don't expand. And so it's kind of a double whammy on your endothelial cells and that nitric oxide, because now we have a thickening blood vessel, but additionally, that chemical response of expanding that blood vessel is not working as well. So we have a tighter, narrower passageway that's less likely to expand, which obviously is going to lead to hypertension. On top of that, another thing that can lead to hypertension here is that insulin acts on your adrenal glands. And one of the things that your adrenal glands produce is a compound called aldosterone. And so aldosterone is responsible for telling your kidneys how much sodium to excrete. So if you have, this is why typically like changing levels of sodium in your diet don't have a huge impact on your circulating levels, because if you eat a ton of salt, that aldosterone will tell your body, hey, we need to excrete a lot of sodium. Or if you don't have enough salt, if you do something where you're trying to get rid of salt and you're just drinking tons of water and you're not eating any salt. Now you can get dangerously low on those salt levels, but what aldosterone will do is tell your kidneys, hey, quit, let the water go, but quit excreting sodium. Now, when too high levels of insulin are acting on those adrenal glands and increasing those levels of aldosterone, it's telling your kidneys, hold on to that sodium. It keeps getting that message. Don't excrete the sodium. Don't excrete the sodium. Now, wherever sodium goes, water goes. So if we have high levels of circulating sodium, we're going to retain a lot of water. If we have more fluid, that means more blood volume, which means higher blood pressure. And so a lot of people, if they experience blood pressure, they'll take, or high blood pressure, hypertension, they might take something referred to as like a water pill or a diuretic to make them try to throw off a lot of water quickly to reduce that blood volume and lower that blood pressure. So if we're having that insulin resistant symptom where we're producing less aldosterone and maintaining a lot of water, then we're going to have higher blood pressure in combination with those thickened cell walls from the endothelial growth and that reduction of nitric oxide that is keeping those blood vessels from dilating. 3 things right there, super dangerous, that obviously can lead to stroke and a heart attack if those are not kept in check. Now, additionally, that whole process of retaining water can lead to things like swelling, bloating, holding a lot of water weight, particularly swelling around the ankles. That's typically going to be one of the first places you see it, and in your hands. If your hands start looking real thick, some people will notice that you're having a hard time getting your rings off. You have some edema, some swelling, bloating, whatever. So another good warning sign. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, definitely a sign of insulin resistance. This is something that more and more women are dealing with. There's a lot of things happening here, but it's a disruption of the natural process of the ovaries when they should be producing estrogen in appropriate levels and very limited amounts of testosterone. That can kind of change in polycystic ovarian syndrome. There will be too high of a production of testosterone, not enough estrogen, which will lead to things like, one, as the name suggests, cysts in the ovaries that can be very painful and can rupture. Additionally, body hair growth. So women starting to grow a lot of facial hair, that's another symptom of polycystic ovarian syndrome. Even things like trouble breastfeeding. There is a lot of problems that come along with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and it's something that's definitely worthwhile keeping in check. Big sign of insulin resistance. A few more, craving carbohydrates. If you're going through these crazy high blood glucose, high insulin levels, this is going back and forth. People often crave sweet things, bread, pasta, sugar, those carb cravings. Should not be a natural process. It's so ubiquitous. We experience it so much that we think it's just kind of a normal part of being a human being. It isn't. It should not be. So something else to keep in mind there. All right. So I went through a lot of stuff there, and believe it or not, there are plenty more symptoms to insulin resistance. But I think these are some of the ones that are most impactful. I mean, you can even go to the fact that most cancer cells are fed by glucose, and, not being able to pull the glucose out of your system, potentially leads to feeding cancer cells because you have circulating sugars that those cancer cells will feed off of. Additionally, high insulin levels will increase the amount of insulin receptors in a place like your prostate. So having really high insulin resistance and having those high circulating levels will lead to prostate growth because, again, insulin is really anabolic. And so it will start acting on those receptor sites in the prostate and make that prostate grow. Same can go for things like a breast cancer cell or breast cancer tumor will start to accrue more insulin sites where the insulin can act, start depositing more glucose and make it grow. So obviously this is a very, very important thing to regulate. Now, why is this becoming so common? Like I mentioned before, we have access to more processed food than we ever have. Sugar is inexpensive. It's in most things. Additionally, wheat is all over the place and it's in our diet all the time. Contrary to popular belief, wheat is very quickly digested. It increases your blood sugar levels higher than eating table sugar. So that seems crazy, but it's true. There's a chemical in there called amylopectin A that is really readily broken down into sugar, which shoots your blood sugar levels up super high, shoots that insulin up, all that. So, again, the reason that we're getting that insulin resistant level is those blood sugar levels are staying high and the insulin is trying to push it down, and it's becoming less effective. When it becomes less good at that process, the insulin has to get higher and higher and higher to keep trying to keep that blood sugar in check. Now, an interesting thing about that is that people can be insulin resistant and their blood sugar levels may not be really indicative of that. They're probably a little high, but they're not super high yet, because even though it's taking more and more insulin to have the desired effect, it's still somewhat keeping that blood sugar in check. So really the best way to look at insulin resistance to check for that would be to test insulin levels, but that's not a commonly done test. So that's why most people will just stick to testing their blood glucose and then start looking at, do I have some of the symptoms that are mentioned here? Now, I don't want to make anybody afraid without giving you some sort of, potential path to move down of how could you help? How could you maybe improve the situation if some of these things sound like something that's affecting you? Two things in combination. One, as I mentioned in a video before, the best insulin sensitizing organ in your body is your muscles, because they are such a big organ and they demand a lot of sugar when they're placed under certain circumstances, which helps you pull that blood glucose out of your system, which makes your insulin and your pancreas not have to work quite as hard. So obviously resistance training is going to be one of the top things you can do. Now, I do want you to know, if you are dealing with these symptoms and you do have insulin resistance, or you are type 2 diabetic, that high level of glucose is damaging your pancreatic beta cells. It's the cells that produce insulin. As long as you still have beta cells, this can be reversed with lifestyle diet change. It can be reversed. You can get these blood glucose levels back in check. However, if you go for so long that this glucotoxicity and this hyperinsulinemia kills off those beta cells, you will have to take insulin. So, because you just will not be able to produce it anymore. So get this in check before you get to that level where you kill off all your beta cells. So like I said, resistance training is going to be the number one thing. You want to use the muscles to burn up that glucose in your system. If you only had 30 minutes a week, which is not enough, you should be at least getting 30 minutes of moderate activity 5 days a week. But if you only had a really limited amount of time to exercise each week, the best bang for your buck would be resistance training, not cardio, not going out and going for a walk. If you only had 30 minutes, you think, okay, well, I'm going to go get a walk real quick, get some resistance bands, go to the gym, whatever, lift some weights, but try to use some muscle. That's going to burn up more sugar and help push those blood glucose levels down, which will help push that insulin level down. Additionally, like I mentioned in the beginning, what increases your blood glucose levels the most is going to be carbohydrates. Protein will increase it a little bit. Fat will increase it almost none. So obviously, if we want to reduce that blood glucose, one of the things we can do is reduce our carbohydrate consumption, push your fat levels higher, and push your protein up. So the protein levels are debatable about, people have different ideas of what you should be eating. 1.5 grams per kilogram at least typically is a good measure. 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Some people will go as high as 1 gram per pound, but that kind of depends on your age as well as your body fat percentage. So push that protein up. It's going to increase your blood glucose level a little bit, but not nearly as much as carbohydrates. Push the fat levels up. You can start deriving a lot of your energy from fat rather than sugar. A lot of people at this point have heard of something ketosis, where your body starts using ketones rather than glucose to produce some energy. And you can still produce some glucose in your body from that protein through a process called gluconeogenesis. It's a little more complicated than I want to get into here. But just knowing that the number one thing you can do, reduce sugary foods, cut out wheat. I'm going to do, like I said, a whole other video about why you really probably should not be eating wheat, but get the wheat out, and then push those other carbohydrate places down. What I typically tell people that I'm working with on diet and exercise is eat for nutrient density, not energy density. So if something does not have a lot of micronutrients, it doesn't have a lot of vitamins, it doesn't have a lot of minerals, it just has a lot of calories, stay away from it. White rice, white potatoes, cereal, pasta, bread, those have a lot of calories, not a lot of micronutrients. So try to really get those micronutrients high and keep those, those super calorie dense, not micronutrient dense stuff down. Eat meat. Meat is a great source of protein and fat. Fatty cuts of meat will help you with your energy levels. Eat organs. A lot of people kind of steer away from them, but organs are extremely nutrient dense. They have a lot of calories in them, but that's fine because those calories are going to come from fat and protein. And vegetables, greens, those are super nutrient dense. They're typically pretty low calorie as long as you stay away from starchy vegetables, and they're going to increase your levels of fiber, particularly prebiotic fiber, which is going to feed your gut bacteria in your stomach, which can also help with your insulin levels. So I hope this is helpful. At least maybe there's something here that maybe you think, maybe there's something here that I need to work on, something you might have heard some symptoms in there that you maybe are experiencing. It might be worthwhile talking to a doctor and getting some stuff like I said, blood glucose is not the best measure, but you could get your glucose levels checked, figure out if you're pre-diabetic. A lot of people are, something like 80 million people in the country are pre-diabetic, and then go from there. Ask for an insulin test. Ask your circulating levels of insulin to be tested. It's not typically in a blood panel, but your doctor will probably do it if you request it, or you could get it done online. I don't, off the top of my head, know a good source to do that, but if you just search for insulin level tests, you could find something to, send off and do a lab test that gets that checked out. So, increase those nutrient-dense foods, lower those really calorie-dense carbohydrates, and increase your activity levels. And in combination, there is tons and tons of evidence that you can really back this thing off. You can get those blood glucose levels back in check, get those insulin levels back in check, and get your body performing the way that it should, reducing that abdominal fat, maybe reducing some of those, those achy joints, which in turn will lead to even more activity for you and typically a healthier, more capable life. If you need help with this stuff, with exercise and diet, I'd be happy to help. You can go to brooksbrowncoaching.com. I have full plans on there where I can work with you on both your diet and your exercise training stuff to help you set up anything from really basic, I don't want to go to the gym, but I need to get out of the recliner, all the way to I want a workout plan. I'm going to be in Golds, 5 or 6 days a week. And, I want a full diet plan. Additionally, you have an option on there where if you just want to call and talk to me, you have a plan already, you want to know, are you doing the right thing? There's an option for there. You can schedule a call with me and we can go through your plan and talk about maybe the pros and cons and do a few tweaks on that. So check that out, brooksbrowncoaching.com. If you haven't already and you made it this far, I would appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe. I'm going to have more content for you. I'm doing my best to really give you, high quality content that is stuff that's actionable, that really gives you good intel on these sort of things. So again, I appreciate you watching and look forward to talking to you next time.